Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 223. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Doug Kari about his debut true crime novel, The Berman Murders, Unraveling the Mojave Desert's most mysterious unsolved crime. In this book, Doug chronicles the 1986 disappearance of Barry Berman, heir to the Kahlua fortune, and his wife Louise, from Saline Valley, California, located in the Mojave Desert and one of the most remote locations in the United States. Their bodies were eventually discovered by the local sheriff's office, but the double homicide was never solved, and no one was ever arrested, let alone convicted, for their murders. After years of research, investigation, and interviews, Doug names the most likely suspect and details how he linked the murders to an overseas sex crimes and trafficking case. In this episode, I'll chat with Doug about his writing journey, how he heard about the Berman case on one of his own trips to Saline Valley, and why his grandmother is the reason he became so interested in the desert, as well as a few other things coming up. Doug Kari, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, Stacey, it's my pleasure to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your debut true crime novel, The Berman Murders, Unraveling the Mojave Desert's most mysterious unsolved crime. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Stacey, what inspired me to write the Berman Murders was the location itself. This crime took place in one of the most extraordinary places in the Western United States, and a place that's very near and dear to my heart, Saline Valley, California, which is in the Mojave Desert and is an incredibly isolated and beautiful place. It's almost like time stood still. Getting there is a challenge. Just getting into this valley, 50 miles on a rough dirt road. You have to cross a mountain range when you can even access it. But when you're there, it's this extraordinarily beautiful valley. Picture a wide open location ringed by mountains with rippling sand dunes, a saltwater lake, and in the middle of this valley, hot springs, natural hot springs that over the years have been developed by hippie types and counterculture folks and libertarians and nudists and such into a clothing optional hot springs oasis with palm trees and kind of away from conventional society, a getaway spot if you know about it. And what inspired me to write the book was that in the middle of this extraordinary location, a couple from Santa Barbara, California, took a morning walk and never came back. 3 years later, their bodies were found miles away in a shallow grave. And the question, of course, was who done it and why?
Yes, I can see how that would inspire you to investigate and write a book. So, okay, let's talk about how you learned about this case. Like, what tipped you off to it?
So this happened in January 1986. Set the time frame. This was right about the time that my daughter was born, and my wife and I went out to Saline Valley not long after that and heard about this on one of our visits. Now, I've been going to Saline Valley for years. I'm a desert explorer type of person by background. My grandmother was a prospector in the Mojave Desert, an extraordinary woman. It was really because of her that I fell in love with the desert. When my grandfather died, she moved to a cabin in the middle of the Mojave. I mean, the real deal with kerosene lamps, and she would gather relics, mining type relics, and interesting objects. She planted a beautiful garden, and she staked mining claims all over the desert. It was because of her that I fell in love with the desert. And Saline Valley was one of my favorite places. And it's not a big community out there, but it's a close knit community. And when you go out there, imagine an apparent murder has occurred. You start At first it was a disappearance. What happened to these people? It was very strange and troubling. And then later it became clear they'd been murdered. There was all kinds of talk about it.
Mm. What kind of research do you do? Because obviously this is a case, right? So it was an open case. Police were investigating. What do you do just as a private citizen as far as research into this book?
By the time I got into doing research for the Berman murders, I'd already started doing journalism as I guess you'd call it a hobby or an avocation. By day, I'm a chief legal officer at a technology company, but as I mentioned, the desert is a huge lure for me. And as well, writing has always been something I've focused on. But I began doing journalism as an avocation. And what I did here, by the time I decided to look into this, decades had passed. It was 2014. The case had been cold for many years. And initially, Stacy, it was really just curiosity. What could I find out? There are a network of people that I know that are interested in that part of the desert. I started making phone calls and just asking them, who should I call? Who might know about this case? One thing led to another. I ended up connected with the Inyo County, California Sheriff's Office. They are the ones who have jurisdiction over that area. And long story short, they agreed to make their case files available to me so that I could take a hard look at the case and perhaps stir up more interest in it, maybe come up with a fresh lead.
Interesting. Okay. So how long did you spend researching, looking into the case before you started writing the story?
Well, it was both. I began researching and looking into the case in 2014, and in 2015, I wrote a cover story for LA Weekly. So at that point, I had done enough to feel that I had something to go to press with. But then I just kept going and going and going, off and on for 9 years before finally completing a book on the subject. And in that time, more avenues opened, more people surfaced, and I was able to gather more information. This is one of those cases, though, Stacy, where there wasn't a lot. So I really had to scour to get the information.
So take us back to what you found out about the case. So we know a couple went missing. 3 years later, their bodies are found. That's a long time. And then it's still open, like it's still a cold case. So what were you able to find out? And where does the information sort of stop?
So once I started connecting with friends and family of the victims who were very generous in providing me their recollections about the case and just the backgrounds of the two victims, two extraordinary people, by the way. They appeared like just kind of hippie campers, but Barry Berman was the heir apparent to the Kahlua liquor fortune. So these were not average kind of people, and they were also disciples of Punjabi guru. So they were very interesting, two very interesting people. But what I really found out about the nature of the case came from a little bit hearsay from friends and family. But once law enforcement started talking with me, I got a clearer picture of what was going on. What was going on, Stacy, was that they had identified somebody they thought was a likely perpetrator, but just hadn't been able to gather enough evidence. What I wanted to do was take a hard look and see, did they have the right person? Did it appear that they had good cause to focus on a suspect, or was there somebody else? And then as to that suspect, was there something they missed? Was there more evidence perhaps that could help bring the case to closure? So that's how I started uncovering what I could about the case and putting it together into a cover story and ultimately a book that concluded, yes, they had good reason to identify Michael Pepe, a Marine Corps captain who was camping alone at the same remote set of hot springs where the Bermans were camped. In fact, they were camped right next to each other and had shared one of these hot baths the night before the Bermans disappeared. And he had been seen departing in the same direction as them up a rough road. They had gone on a morning hike. He was driving a little truck. He came back later in the day covered in dust and acting very nervous. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence that pointed his direction. And Stacy, we're talking about a place that is as much the middle of nowhere as you can probably find on the North American continent. I mean, even though by air it's only a couple of 100 miles from Los Angeles, because of the geography, it's very isolated. So you don't have a long list of people who could potentially be the suspect. I mean, there were only a few other campers in this location. So the circumstances certainly pointed his direction.
But no hard evidence to lead them to any sort of prosecution.
That was the difficulty in the case and remains the difficulty. Just to get to the bottom line, although I think my book helped bring closure by presenting all of the facts surrounding the case, including new evidence. There wasn't the kind of empirical or what you might call hard evidence, DNA evidence, something like that, physical evidence. It was circumstantial, and there were no eyewitnesses other than people who observed Pepe's behavior before and after the Bermans disappeared. But I mean, the circumstantial evidence was quite remarkable. They had managed, the Inyo County Sheriff's Office had managed to identify him, which was a whole thing in itself, trying to identify him. All they knew is that his name was Mike, or Mike the Marine. People in Saline Valley often use handles, don't even use their real names sometimes, but they managed to track him down. Remarkable piece of detective work. And actually, less than a year after the Bermans disappeared, he was interviewed in a tape-recorded interview. And I was able to get a transcript of that interview. And his answers were all over the place. I mean, from the perspective of a lawyer, I mentioned I'm a lawyer, although I don't do criminal defense work. Still, I'm familiar with it. I've handled a couple of cases pro bono over the years. If he was my client, I would have advised him not to talk, because his story kept changing, which is indicative of somebody who's not telling the truth. And not only did his story keep changing, Stacy, he had very good recollection about everything except the trip in question. So he had all these details, and he was very chatty and could talk about a lot of details about Saline Valley, different trips he'd taken. Suddenly you come to January 6, 1986, and what did he do on the day the Bermans disappeared? And he offered various versions of possible events. He wanted to keep his options open, it appeared.
So what was it about this case as compared to others that you've investigated? Because this is not the only one that you have looked into, but what was it about this one that made you decide to write the book, or at least start with this case for writing the book?
Right. I did reach that point, Stacy, where I'd written the cover story, and I thought, well, is this it? I had written a couple of follow-up articles, but there was just a lot to it, starting with the location. It's difficult to imagine a crime of this nature, a double murder taking place in such a beautiful kind of spiritual environment. It's just completely counterintuitive. You think of double murders happening perhaps for a business reason or a romantic a love triangle or drug related or something like that, as opposed to a hippie couple on a camping trip, kind of a makeup trip. They'd had some issues in their marriage. Now they're off on a makeup trip. They're in this place where people sort of casually meet each other in a very peaceful, loving environment, and suddenly end up dead in a shallow grave. It was such a remarkable location and such a counterintuitive crime that made it interesting to me. But also the victims. I mentioned that Barry was the heir apparent to the Kahlua liquor fortune. Louise was 17 years older, which makes it interesting. That's not something you see often, where, especially during that time period, a middle-aged woman with a younger man. She had been married 4 times. Barry was her 4th husband. She had 3 children from 2 different men. She'd had a troubled life, a troubled childhood. She was a survivor of sexual abuse. And to see this sort of odd couple was very interesting to me. But they were both also very enlightened kind of people. By that I mean they truly believed in their spirituality. They would meditate for transcendental meditation for hours a day. They didn't believe in violence. They shunned meat, for example, because they were nonviolent kind of people. And they were just very interesting. Their group of friends were interesting. They met at a time when Barry's father, who was the Jules Berman, the man behind building Kahlua into this massive success, he owned a 3,500 acre ranch on the coast north of Santa Barbara, extraordinary landscape. And Barry and Louise and friends who were devotees of Charan Singh, the Punjabi guru that I mentioned, they lived in a little colony, I guess you'd call it, three little cabins by the ocean. And so here are these people living in this extraordinary situation, practicing meditation, who go out to the desert. And then, of course, my own interest in the desert and in that particular area, and just the nature of the whole event, the way it affected the community out there, the way it affected me. I was someone who was just shocked that this place that I thought of as being separate and apart from societal ills and societal norms, kind of a place where you could just be free and people walked around without clothes on, and that just doesn't seem like the place for a murder. So all those factors together drew me into the story. I wanted to explore their lives. I wanted to know more about Pepe, and I wanted to put down on paper some of the things that make Saline Valley in that setting so extraordinary. And then, of course, I wanted to take a shot at seeing what I could find out about him, about the crime. And it led me in just fascinating directions, including all the way overseas to Cambodia, as I followed Pepe's footsteps.
And do you think after all that research and writing this book, do you think you found as many answers as you think are out there, or does it still leave you with questions?
It leaves me with questions. I would love to talk with him. Now, just to fast forward a bit, Stacy, what ends up happening, Pepe is investigated both by the sheriff's office and by federal investigators from the predecessor to NCIS, because he was a U.S. Marine, and also because the crime occurred on federal land, public land. He could be investigated both by state and federal investigators, and ultimately he was. After the sheriff's office gave up, federal investigators took over, but they weren't able to push the case through to completion either. They focused on him also. Everyone was sure that they had the guy, They just didn't have enough evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So I followed his path. It turned out that after retiring from the Marine Corps, he moved to Cambodia, Stacy. And when he was there, he rented a luxury villa. Just to step back for a second, Cambodia in the early 2000s when he retired, and I think still today, but especially back then, was an impoverished place, still reeling from the effects of civil war and the killing fields of Pol Pot. And because of that, the country was kind of lawless, corrupt, and Pepe and others, Westerners, primarily Western men, took advantage of this. Pepe went over there, and with his Marine Corps pension, that made him kind of a wealthy man. He got a part-time job teaching English and business at a school. He rented a luxury villa, and he used his power, prestige, his money to set up a harem of underage girls living with him in his villa. And he just did the most horrific things imaginable with these little girls. I'm talking 9, 10, 11-year-old girls, tiny little girls, too, very much more petite than your average, say, American child. And he wasn't just having sex with these girls. He was torturing them. And I think, in fact, that he was expressing some of the sexual sadism that may provide a psychological explanation for what took place in the Berman murders. Anyway, ultimately, he was arrested for those crimes, which opened up a whole nother avenue that I had no idea about, of course, when I first got involved in the case.
Where does the case go from here, do you think? I mean, with all of this information, does it go anywhere? Can it go anywhere?
So ultimately what happens, Stacy, is he was arrested in Cambodia for these crimes against children, even though it's a corrupt country, even though they kind of look the other way on pedophilia and those kinds of crimes. His behavior was so extreme that agents from ICE and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement stationed out of the U.S. Embassy in Phnom Penh and Cambodian authorities teamed up to investigate Pepe. He was arrested by Cambodian authorities, ultimately handed over to U.S. authorities, and brought to Los Angeles to stand trial on federal charges. There are laws on the books that make it unlawful to engage in those kinds of crimes against children anywhere in the world if you're a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. Anybody who's subject to U.S. jurisdiction, you can be prosecuted for those crimes. He was. That opened a whole long travail of legal action. There was a trial, a conviction, a successful appeal, a retrial, but ultimately he was sentenced to prison, and that's where he remains. But while he was in prison, he had a circle of friends, people that he talked with, and allegedly he told them about killing the Bermans. And this evidence emerged because of my cover story and was brought to the police and became a core part of a reinvestigation of the case that took place in 2015 to 2017 and resulted in a referral to the Inyo County District Attorney with fresh interviews of witnesses, new evidence and such. But ultimately, even with that, the DA's office passed on the prosecution. So I don't think there's going to be anything more unless he were to confess, which I don't believe he will. There were a couple of his family members, 2 of his sisters, who cooperated with my book. They told me don't expect that he'll ever tell the truth about what happened out there.
But he is in prison. So if not on this for this crime, for others.
That's right. He is in prison, and I do think that the book provides some answers about what law enforcement believes happened, what I believe happened. Of course, we don't know for certain, and it's important to point out Pepe's never been arrested on these charges, let alone brought in front of a jury and convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. However, that doesn't stop us from trying to figure it out and deciding for ourselves what we think happened. And he's declined my many invitations to speak with me about it, tell me his version of events. That hasn't happened.
Yeah. Well, and that makes me wonder, what are the challenges of writing true crime stories, particularly unsolved true crime stories?
Well, it can be quite difficult, especially when you're dealing with a case that's so old. It's interesting, Stacy. The current project I'm working on is a deep dive into the abduction and murder of a teenage girl in northern Nevada in 2022. It was a high profile case. She was abducted from a Walmart parking lot. And in that case, I have a wealth of information. Thousands of pages of police records, law enforcement who are cooperating with me, family, friends. There's just so much available, contemporaneous videos, photographs, all kinds of evidence and material that I can draw from. And it's really a matter of winnowing that down to the essential details and weaving it into a story, which really the focus is sort of that story about the Naomi Irion case is more of a deep dive into why this happened, a deep look into Naomi's extraordinary life for a young woman, and then the perpetrator's dark nature and dark history, and weaving those together. In the Berman case, by contrast, it was the absence of material that made it so difficult. It took me years to develop some of the sources and get the information, and then of course, as I'm working on the book, all of the stuff involved with Michael Pepe's trial, appeal, etc., on sex crimes charges was playing out in real time. So I was attending court hearings and getting involved in real time, writing articles. I was publishing articles as all of that was going on, and watching it develop. And the challenge was getting the material and weaving together the bits and pieces covering a 30 plus year time span into a coherent story that brings you from start to finish and gives you a sense of what happened and why. And that ultimately was the goal. I feel gratified about the result, though, because the friends and family really thanked me for having done that endeavor, and felt that they now had a sense of completion, a sense of closure that they didn't have before.
Yeah, yeah. I imagine it helps to have the families on board with you, providing information and cooperating and agreeing to be interviewed. Is that a requirement, do you think, to write the book?
Well, that's a great question. I've never done a story where I didn't have cooperation from the family. If a family was kind of on the fence about an interesting case, I might push forward. If a family was opposed because of the pain or privacy concerns, it would be difficult for me, I think, to push forward in a case, unless, of course, I thought there might be some family involvement, especially when you're talking about, let's say, violence against women. A lot of violence against women, most violence against women, is committed by people they know, family member, an intimate partner, that kind of thing. It's one of the things you learn if you get into the true crime world, is just the shocking level of violence against women. It's really quite troubling, and the fact that it's often intimate partners that are responsible for it. In a case like that, I'd have no problem pushing forward. Yes, but in both the Berman murders and in the project that I'm finishing up now, the Naomi Irion case, in both of those, I had strong support from the families, and I don't think I would have done it without that support. It was essential both from an informational level, and also just from a sense of good energy, good intentions, good karma, to be doing a story, writing a story, working on a story where the family was supporting it. Because keep in mind, for the friends and families involved, this is just life changing, life altering kind of event. These aren't these aren't situations that are done for the entertainment value. These are deeply troubling kinds of events. And when I explore them, I want to explore them with a sense of the seriousness that's present there. I mean, I focus on telling a good story. If you can't tell a good story, there's no point in writing it. I want it to be interesting, and I don't expect that the reader is going to share in all the emotional responses of the family, and I want there to be a good whodunit, a puzzle aspect to all of it. But at the same time, you have to respect that these are real people and real events. This isn't some sort of a fictional endeavor.
Yeah. Do you have other crimes in the wings that you think might merit book treatment, or have these two just been so special or so interesting that they've merited a treatment in a full book?
That's a great question, and both of these grew into books, as it were.
Mm.
The Berman case, as I mentioned, after I wrote the cover story and a couple of follow-up stories, I wondered how far would I go with this, but something just drove me to keep going. I didn't want to stop. It also, of course, didn't hurt that I got that fresh information. I mean, when I got outreach from prisoners telling me that Michael Pepe had misrepresented himself in prison. They didn't realize he was a child molester and that he had actually talked about murdering the Bermans. Now that's a potential breakthrough in the case, new information after decades. And so that pushed me to keep going with it and ultimately to write a book. In the Naomi Irion case, kind of a similar path in a sense. I wrote 2 articles about the case for the Las Vegas Review-Journal, the largest paper in Nevada. Got a lot of public interest in the case, and I just decided to keep going. I think it was the complicated past of the perpetrator. The man who murdered Naomi Irion was a 41-year-old construction supervisor, well-spoken, good writer. Isn't that interesting? He's a good writer. He had a girlfriend, good-looking guy with a girlfriend, drove a fancy truck. Uh, you would think that he'd kind of had it all. What drives a person like that to kidnap a young woman in the early morning hours as she's sitting in her car in a parking lot waiting to catch a shuttle bus for her shift at the Tesla battery factory, take her out into the desert, and end up leaving her in a pre-dug grave and then going home as if nothing had happened. Hi, honey, I'm home. That's something that I wanted to understand, that I felt I needed to try to understand. And that I do feel that after plumbing the depths of his background and working with a psychologist with experience and expertise in criminal behavior and the psychopathology of that I have some answers and answers that I can tell in a fast-paced story that includes a lot of interesting material, so that I can tell a story that if you're a true crime person, you're just going from page to page wanting to know what comes next. But if you're also someone who really wants to come out of something not just having said, wow, that's crazy, but you actually want to come out with some understanding of why these things happen, that's part of what I want to bring to the table. And there's a book length amount of material in that kind of an exploration. But it just sort of happened. I have 2 missing person cases, Stacey, that I've followed for a long time and wrote multiple articles on, but I don't have enough in either of those for a book. And I'm not sure what my third book will be yet. It'll sort of have to emerge. I am attracted, though, to the plight of indigenous women who go missing or end up murdered. And I'd like to explore that because I think it's an underserved, underreported area.
You mentioned earlier that writing has become an avocation for you. I'm curious, were you always a writer and the interest in true crime sort of gave you an outlet for that? Or was it the interest in true crime that made you think, perhaps I will start writing about it, but that's not something you considered previously?
Well, I think like a lot of people who write, it's something I knew from a young age that I wanted to do. I would say the first time I thought about writing a book was probably when I was 10 or 11 years old. I grew up in a family where reading was something that we did all the time, and the idea of writing a book was considered to be sort of the highest and best use of a human. And so, having grown up in that kind of environment, it was something that I had thought about for a long time, but I didn't have the right voice. I just I was an English major. I did some journalism in college, but ended up, I think, like a lot of people who are in the liberal arts and sort of aren't sure where to go, you end up going to law school. And in my case, I got drawn into it. I enjoyed the practice of law. Did business litigation, then became an in-house lawyer, and I love the problem solving aspect. It also taught me a lot about legal writing. Legal writing is a form of storytelling, highly constrained. You have to follow the rules of evidence, and you have a lot of structure and framework that surrounds it. But it's all about telling a good story, and I became a good legal writer. I've had a brief that I wrote cited by the Supreme Court. So I know I'm a good legal writer and that I have those research skills. A lot of that dovetails with journalism, Stacy. But I had tried my hand at a couple of novels that didn't go anywhere. I just wasn't that drawn to fiction. I really wanted to write about nonfiction, and I think it just took me decades to really find my voice. But I did my first long form journalism article in 2014 about a copyright case that went to the Supreme Court. It ended up doing very well. I think it got 250,000 views online. I got hundreds of favorable comments, and that gave me the confidence to keep going. But what drew me into the true crime is that it's just interesting, and it's something readers want to read about. You're not just off doing something that's obscure that six people will read. I found that if you dive in, not only is it an interesting subject matter, but a lot of people want to go on that journey with you. And that's gratifying too, to know that there are people who are interested in what it is you're writing about. So I'd say it's the fact that it's a fascinating subject matter and a place where I thought I could add value, and then there's strong reader interest.
Well, if people want to learn more about you, follow along, look for your new release, learn when you have let's say a third book coming out, where can they go to find you and that information?
Sure. So I've got a website. It's Doug Kari. My last name is spelled Kari. That's a Finnish word if anybody's interested in etymology. DougKari.com is my website. I do a monthly blog, and it's got some interesting material about the cases that I've worked on. And then I'm on Facebook at Doug Kari Author, and also on Instagram at Doug Kari Author. So those are places where folks can go. In terms of buying the Berman Murders, it's on Amazon. Just the Berman Murders by Doug Kari. It's gotten good reviews, and it's helped me make a name in the true crime world, among people who I guess you'd call us the more serious true crime folks. We're not just trying to knock out dime store or kind of pulp fiction, but we're really trying to do things in depth, bring a more serious approach, but at the same time, good storytelling. You don't want your story to be dry. I want to write good stories, but but also be serious about it, really take it seriously. I think that the victims, the families, the law enforcement people who put their hearts into these cases, they deserve no less than a writer who just immerses themselves in it and really brings everything to bear in writing about what happened and why.
Right. Very well said. Well, Doug, I want to wish you luck with the Berman Murders and the new book that you are finishing. We'll look forward to that. So, congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you, Stacy.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.